Greetings there, academic proletariat, and welcome to this episode of the Fireside Chats with Mr. Olson, where we will be discussing the Age of Jackson. So, because we have a debate coming up in class, for those of you that are in my class, I want you to know that I'm going to try and keep this as objective as possible because I don't want to favor either side. So let me get this out of the way before we go on any further. I love you, Andrew Jackson. You're the man. My heart beats only for thee. All right, just want to remind you that there is a guided note sheet that goes along with it. It looks something like this. You can fill it out as we go. So we're actually going to start with a little bit of review here. We're going to talk quickly about the era of good feelings. That was a period between 1816 and 1824 where there was really only one political party, as evidenced by the campaign or the election map to the right of 1820. You can see that James Monroe won in literally a landslide. And so it gets referred to as the era of good feelings because if there's only one political party, there can't be bickering back and forth, so things are great. However, not so much, even though there was this nationalism that had developed out of the War of 1812, especially with regard to the Battle of New Orleans and the increased connections of the different American regions, this sort of intense patriotism, and the decisions made by the Marshall Court. There was also a lot of sectionalism caused mostly by slavery, exemplified by the Missouri Compromise, but also disagreement over those internal improvements and the growth of agrarian and industrial economies in the different American regions. So this is sort of the historical context. This sets the tone for the Age of Jackson, but I want you to really reflect on, was this an era of good feelings? No, there has to be something that happens between 1820 and 1825 that sort of leads to this breakup of unity. So let's talk about some of the things that came out of this era of not so good feelings, one of which is the election of 1824. In this election of 1824, it saw four people run against one another. After the outcome of the election, Andrew Jackson had most of the popular vote, at least more than anybody else. He didn't have a majority, but one thing he lacked was a majority in the Electoral College, and for all you Constitution aficionados, you will know that without a majority in the Electoral College, there can't be a winner, so it goes to the House of Representatives. In the House of Representatives, Henry Clay, who was Speaker of the House, basically took a bribe from John Quincy Adams to convince House members to throw their weight in Adams' corner, and that's how we get Adams winning the election of 1824. He basically makes a backroom deal with Henry Clay that if Henry Clay gets the House to vote for John Quincy Adams instead of Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay would be able to be Secretary of State. So that's how it happens. Anyways, not a good start for John Adams, and his presidency isn't really that great either. He's very qualified to be the president. However, his time in office is plagued by this corrupt bargain, which got him in. It's also riddled with diplomatic issues, and the tariff which his administration passes in 1828, also known as the Tariff of Abominations, angered the South and made his presidency quite tumultuous. Which leads to the election of 1828, in which Andrew Jackson wins in another landslide. So this election is unique in American history because it saw the lowering of voting requirements. Basically, many states removed the property qualification from the requirement to vote. So now instead of being a white landowner to vote, you could just be a white man. So in most states, universally white men are able to vote. However, women can't vote, minorities can't vote, slaves can't vote, obviously Indians can't vote. That's just sort of the law of the land. However, it's a step in the right direction. Now, Andrew Jackson, of course, wins that election. He gets into office. And before we start talking about his presidency, I want to sort of outline four major issues or ideas that come up during his presidency. The first is the attitude towards common Americans, Native Americans, states' rights, and the bank war all sort of characterize his administration. Those are going to be our four major topics for this video. So we'll go ahead and start by Andrew Jackson, his appeal to the common man. His background was that of a rough country frontiersman, and that's sort of who he catered to. He was given the nickname Old Hickory after the War of 1812 because he was just so awesome in battle. He was tough as hickory. So people at the bottom of the social ladder seeking a fortune, and also those who were in need of land loved Andrew Jackson because his rhetoric sort of spoke directly to them. And then when he gets into office, he institutes what's known as the spoils system, which is this idea that the president has the power to reward government jobs to his friends. It's otherwise known as patronage. All politicians do it. All those people, especially in the presidency do it, but Andrew Jackson was sort of upset the status quo because he fired a lot of the revolutionary figures to put his friends in office. So even though he's appealing to the common man, he's sort of doing so in a way that some people frown upon. Okay, so to move on, let's talk about Native American removal. If you're a visual learner, Indian removal worked like this. There were some Indians around Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Andrew Jackson came in riding on a horse, and he removed those Indians west of the Mississippi River to what is now Oklahoma. I'd show it to you again, but we're pressed for time. Okay, so Andrew Jackson's belief or his attitudes towards the Native Americans mirrored that of most common men, so most small farmer white Americans thought that the Native Americans were savages, they were situated on valuable land, and they posed a threat to American expansion. And so Andrew Jackson thought that those Indians were in danger, so that's why he crafted the Indian Removal Act of 1830. He's seen here in the right side of the screen with the natives sort of looking up to him. He thought that he was their great white father, which incidentally happens to be the name of this cartoon. So his solution to the problem of the natives being on land that white people want, remove them. So he pushes through Congress the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which gives Native Americans land west of the Mississippi River. It's land that is not very fertile. It's not really a wonderful place to live. It's sort of deserty almost, and so it's less lucrative. So the natives are being removed from rich, fertile farmland that just happens to have a little bit of gold on it to land that really's got a whole bunch of nothing. But it sort of establishes the government as a protectorate over the tribes. Even though John Marshall had ruled in a Supreme Court decision that the natives within the United States constituted their own sovereign nation, Andrew Jackson sort of upsets that Supreme Court case ruling with his support of the Indian Removal Act. Now, the Cherokee didn't want to leave, so what they did, they petitioned the Supreme Court, and in said case, Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, saying that they could be a sovereign country. However, Andrew Jackson responds by saying John Marshall has made his decision, let him enforce it. Needless to say, the Supreme Court decision isn't enforced. In addition to that, there's also a small faction of Cherokees that actually do sign a treaty called the Treaty of New Echota with white Americans, and that sort of is the impetus for the Cherokee being removed. Since this treaty exists, even though it didn't represent the sentiments of all Cherokees, or even most Cherokees for that matter, it still sort of seals their fate. Anywho, this Indian Removal Act, which we just talked about, that granted the government the right to remove the Cherokees, results in the Trail of Tears in 1838. The Trail of Tears is pictured here on this map. As you can see, several tribes were removed. The 5 tribes that are listed in the key of this map are considered the 5 civilized tribes, in that they sort of represented the beacon of Native American evolution to this point, but despite the fact that the Cherokee had a written constitution and an alphabet, they were removed nevertheless. Okay, let's move to our issue of states' rights and the tariff. In 1816, Congress passed a tariff, which is a tax on imports that's designed to try and protect domestic manufacturing by making foreign goods more expensive. But what that does is it angers the South, because the South likes buying cheap things from Britain, especially cheap cloth, and they need cloth to clothe their slaves, hopefully you said. Anyways, this is then leads to a rise in export prices of cotton, because if we put a tariff on Britain's goods, they turn around and they put a tariff on ours. So it really makes the South angry. Pictured in the bottom right-hand corner is John C. Calhoun, vice president at the time, who considers this tariff the Tariff of Abominations, called it disgusting and loathsome. I think what's disgusting and loathsome is the chest hair coming out of your shirt, John C. Calhoun. You are an ugly, ugly man. All right, ugly both in character and in looks, apparently. So Calhoun devises this theory of nullification, which questions the federal government's rights over the states. He basically said that if Congress passed a law that the state didn't agree with, they could declare it unconstitutional and just not follow it. So when Congress passes a new tariff in 1832, South Carolina cries afoul because they think that the tariff hasn't been lowered enough, even though it lowered that Tariff of Abominations. So what do? They declare this tariff null and void. So they say that they're not going to pay it, and if the government tries to force them to pay it, they will secede from the Union. Jackson responds in his old fashion with what's known as the force bill. He says that the president has the right to use the army to force compliance of states with federal laws. So he basically threatens civil war. South Carolina steps down because they know that they're no match for the entire federal army. Crisis averted. The last issue of Jackson's presidency is that of the economy and the Bank of the United States. If you recall, Alexander Hamilton got the idea of having a Bank of the United States to both ensure economic, what word am I looking for? Economic stability, and to make sure that the government had a place to store all of its money. That first Bank of the United States, its charter expired in 1811. The bank was then rechartered in 1816 and would be chartered or contracted for 20 years. Jackson hated the bank. He believed that the bank favored the rich. It was private landholders and private bankers, private businessmen who gained interest from the bank. Lower rates were given to the wealthy people, higher rates were given to common men, and so the bank really didn't do a good job of extending equality in a fair way, so Jackson vowed to kill the bank. Anyways, his arch nemesis, Henry Clay, wanted to make the bank an issue in the election of 1832 because he thought that he could catch Jackson doing something unpopular. So he calls for an early recharter of the bank. He wants to recharter it 4 years earlier, but Jackson, being no person to step down from a fight, straight up vetoes the recharter. In your face, Henry Clay, pulls all the money out of the bank, which enrages Nicholas Biddle, who is the president of the bank, because he realizes that this means death to the second Bank of the United States. So Nicholas Biddle responds with a restriction of credit, which means poor farmers can't get loans, which just goes to reinforce what Jackson had been saying about the bank all along, that it favors the rich, it sort of caters to monopolies, and it's not good for common people. Anyways, probably not the best action on Jackson's part. He acted a little hastily here. He takes the money out of the national bank and puts it into what he calls pet banks, or banks that are friendly to Andrew Jackson. So these banks now have more money to loan out. However, they end up printing way too much money, and there's not enough specie to back that money up, which leads to inflation. Now, this inflation, Andrew Jackson gets scared of, so he issues what's called the specie circular, the idea that you can only buy land using hard currency, so physical gold, physical silver. People rush to the bank to exchange their banknotes for gold. The banks run out of gold, and since they issued more notes than they had before, it institutes a panic. So the Panic of 1837, one of the worst panics in American history, which results in 33% unemployment, which is portrayed here in this famous picture called The Times, also in your book if you want to get a look at it, really hurts the American economy. Now, I don't want you to think that this panic is the result of an isolated act by Andrew Jackson. There are other things that go into the panic, such as there was a depression in Europe at the time, there were crop failures in America, so it's not just one thing that causes this panic. However, Andrew Jackson's sort of misguided economic principles certainly didn't help. Obviously, Jackson is a polarizing figure in American history, as you can see by this cartoon to the right. He's so polarizing, in fact, that a political party pops up mostly to oppose him. That party is called the Whigs. The Whig Party was a party in England who opposed the king, and so the Whig Party forms in America to oppose who they see as a kingly type figure, Andrew Jackson. So the Whig Party is characterized exactly by the opposites of what the Democrats were characterized. They support a national bank, whereas the Democrats did not. They support protective tariffs, which the Democrats did not. They support manufacturing, whereas the Democrats supported agriculture, and they support internal improvements, whereas the Democrats thought that internal improvements were too expensive. This was evidenced by Andrew Jackson's famous veto of the Maysville Road bill, which was a bill introduced to try and build a road in Kentucky. However, Andrew Jackson said that since it was only in Kentucky, that Kentucky could pay for it. It wasn't the federal government's job to pay for things that didn't involve interstate commerce. Anyways, when Jackson leaves the presidency in 1837, Martin Van Buren succeeds him and has a really tough time as the president. The Panic of 1837 really plagues his 4 years in office, as does the latter part of the Trail of Tears and Indian removal. He then loses the election of 1840 where William Henry Harrison runs, and William Henry Harrison wins. However, since he gives the longest inaugural speech in history during a rainstorm, he dies. He was kind of old, too. So imagine your grandpa, who's like 70, giving a speech for 3 hours in the rain. Not smart. Anyways, he dies, and his vice president, John Tyler, becomes the president. Tyler, who had been chosen by Whigs to be on the ticket, was really a Democrat at heart, so all he does is serve to reinforce the ideas that Andrew Jackson had come up with in the very first place, which is the reason this period is called the Age of Jackson, because from 1824 until about 1852, Andrew Jackson's ideas rule the day. That's all the time we have for today, proletariat. Peace.